This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Duskmourn cards, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Duskmourn, and in this video I'm continuing with my Duskmourn limited set review. Over the next several days I'll be evaluating every single card in the format to get you ready for your pre-release or the release of the set on Magic Arena. So far I've covered all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards in the set, and today we're looking at blue. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for the video. There are a few things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video, not special guests. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal is to have this set review ready for you in time for the pre-release. And that of course means I'll be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description, where you can find a way to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the blue cards in Duskmourn. Our first one is Abhorrent Oculus, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 5/5 eye at Mythic Rare. As an additional cost to cast this spell, exile 6 cards from your graveyard. It's got flying, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you manifest Dread. This means you look at the top 2 cards of your library, you put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and the other into your graveyard. Turn it face up at any time for its mana cost if it's a creature card. So this is definitely a graveyard format. Even so, I wouldn't count on casting this on 3, but I do think blue decks will be capable of getting this down by turn 5 or 6 without a ton of trouble, and that's plenty early for a cheap big flyer that churns out 2/2s. And keep in mind, those 2/2s have big upside. Even if this was just giving you 2/2 tokens, I would think this is really good, but it helps load your graveyard, and that 2/2 might turn face up later in the game and be a much bigger creature. The setup does keep it from full-on bomb status, but if it turns out to be even easier to get 6 cards in the yard, it could be even better than I'm thinking. For now though, I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Bottomless Pool and Locker Room. This is an enchantment room. This is a new enchantment subtype in the set, and you can cast either half. That door unlocks on the battlefield. As a sorcery, you may pay the mana cost of a locked door to unlock it. So when it's in your hand, you choose which side to cast, and then later you can unlock the other side at sorcery speed. The Bottomless Pool side is 1 blue mana, and when you unlock this door, you return up to 1 target creature to its owner's hand, and the Locker Room side is 4 generic and a blue, and it says whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. This looks like a pretty good room. You cast Bottomless Pool early to get a bit of tempo, and then in the late game it can draw you a card from time to time and help you win. Throw in the fact that this is a cheap way to trigger Eerie, and I think we're talking about a C+. Next up, it's Central Elevator and Promising Stairs, another enchantment room. This one is rare. The Central Elevator side is 3 generic and a blue. When you unlock this door, search your library for a room card that doesn't have the same name as a room you control. Reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. The Promising Stairs side is 2 generic and a blue. At the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1. You win the game if there are 8 or more different names among unlocked doors of rooms you control. So this looks pretty bad for Limited. It's just way too focused on doing room stuff to be very good in most decks in the format, and neither side of it impacts the board at all, and I think that's an important litmus test for most of these rooms. You kind of need a side that adds something to the board. You really can't have 2 sides that don't at all, and that's what we're talking about here. Even in a room-heavy deck, which is what the blue-red deck is supposed to be, spending mana on fiddly things like this is going to be pretty bad. You're just going to get run over. Tutoring up a room on one side and being an alternate win condition on the other side just isn't what you want. Sure, Surveil is nice in the format, but spending all that mana on an enchantment that surveils isn't what you want to do either. I think this is just an F. Next up, it's Clammy Prowler, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common enchantment creature horror. When it attacks, another target attacking creature can't be blocked this turn. This will be able to survive a decent number of attacks with that high toughness, and making something else unblockable can, of course, be pretty valuable. It's a little underwhelming for the cost, but I think any creature that is also an enchantment is going to get an extra bump in this format because of the Eerie mechanic. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Creeping Peeper, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 eye at common. It can tap for blue, but you can spend this mana only to cast an enchantment spell, unlock a door, or turn a permanent face up. The stat line is really not very good, but I think blue decks will be able to easily make use of the mana this produces. You'll be playing lots of enchantments, including doors, and the blue-green deck is a Manifest Dread deck, so this crosses over into basically every blue type as a useful 2-drop. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Cursed Windbreaker, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon artifact equipment. When it enters, you manifest Dread, then attach Cursed Windbreaker to that creature. Equipped creature has flying, and it equips for 3 generic. I can definitely get behind Cursed Windbreaker. While the 3 mana 2/2 flying stat line isn't the quality card it once was, this one delivers lots of additional value, since you get to load your graveyard, put an artifact on the board, and keep an equipment around to give other stuff flying too. Being an artifact has some extra value in a Delirium set as well. It just does a ton for the investment. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Dagger Maw Megalodon, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 5/7 shark at common. It's got vigilance and island cycling for 2 generic. This whole cycle feels a little too inefficient to be great. Like, you won't feel good about cycling this away early, and you won't feel great about a 6 mana 5/7 with vigilance either. And yeah, it can be whatever you need it to be, but neither of those things is that great. I'm giving this a C-. It'll be a pretty easy cut. Next up, it's Don't Make a Sound, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 2 generic. If they do, surveil 2. 2 mana counter spells that make your opponent pay 2 generic have performed reasonably well of late, although most of them have come with a bit more upside than this has. I mean, it's a nice consolation prize that you get to surveil when your opponent can pay, but that's all it is, a consolation prize. It's still going to feel pretty bad to go down a card for no reason apart from a surveil. Still, there are enough times where this will counter a spell on the cheap that I think you'll run one in lots of blue decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Duskmourn's Domination, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. You control enchanted creature, but enchanted creature gets -3/-0 and loses all abilities. Mind control effects are usually insane and limited, because they take away your opponent's best creature and give you that creature. This is substantially worse than that. It's basically a 6 mana removal spell that will give you something, but the thing you get is probably like a 0/3 with no abilities, and it's vulnerable to the format's enchantment removal too, which is kind of a problem. So it's a mind control, but a very underwhelming one that they tried to balance, and I think they succeeded, giving it a C. Next up, it's Enduring Curiosity, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 4/3 enchantment creature cat glimmer at rare. It's got flash, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. When Enduring Curiosity dies, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It's an enchantment, it's not a creature. So basically, you just get the text box when it comes back. A 4 mana 4/3 with flash is decent, and in addition to the usual ambush blocking a card like this pulls off, you can also flash it in after creatures go unblocked, at which point you can suddenly draw cards. And then, of course, Curiosity's effect sticks around even after it's no longer a 4/3. Drawing cards with this seems very doable, and it isn't capped either. Each creature that hits your opponent draws you a card, and your opponent also will have a hard time ever dealing with this completely. I think this is a bomb. It's just going to draw you a lot of extra cards and it has a very reasonable baseline. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Enter the Enigma, which for 1 blue is a common sorcery. Target creature can't be blocked this turn, draw a card. You need to be careful with this. Like, if your opponent can interact in response by getting rid of the targeted creature, you get completely blown out, and because it's a sorcery, that's even more important. And there are tons of situations where the effect doesn't really help you do anything. Still, it's cheap, gives you an effect, and replaces itself. It's probably not going to be a card you always play, but you could do worse, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Entity Tracker, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 human scout at rare. It's got flash, and it has Eerie, which means whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you get something. In this case, you draw a card. This is a great payoff, one that will be relatively easy to trigger with all the enchantments and rooms in the format, and because it has flash, you even have the luxury of waiting to flash it in at the end of your opponent's turn until you know you can trigger the Eerie on your next turn. That means it will be pretty easy to set up at least a 2-for-1 with this, and it won't be that hard for it to turn into an insane value engine, as the more cards you draw, the more likely it is you find more things that trigger Eerie. I think all of that makes this a bomb. The 2-for-1 seems easy to get, and the upside beyond that is nuts, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Erratic Apparition, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common creature spirit. It's 1/3 with flying and vigilance. It has Eerie. It gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If this was always a 3 mana 2/4 with flying and vigilance, it'd be pretty close to a B-. Like, that's a really good stat line on offense and defense. Obviously, this is substantially worse than that, and it will rarely be a 2/4 during your opponent's turn, but it does seem like blue decks will have it be a 2/4 often enough for it to be fine, giving it a C. Next up, it's Fear of Failed Tests, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 2/7 enchantment creature Nightmare at uncommon. When it deals combat damage to a player, draw that many cards. I'm not really feeling this. You aren't going to be able to get in with a hit with it all that often since it only has 2 power. I really wish they had stuck Vigilance on it, as that would make things far more interesting. As it is, it's a clunky defensive creature that will draw you some cards on rare occasions. I think it's a D+. Next up, it's Fear of Falling, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is an enchantment creature Nightmare at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it attacks, target creature defending player controls gets -2/-0 and loses flying until your next turn. Air Elemental really isn't what it once was. Over the last several sets, we've seen many underwhelming 5-mana 4/4 flyers, and this kind of feels like another one. When you're spending 5 on something these days, it kind of needs to do something meaningful right away, and this doesn't. So it dying to really cheap removal is absolutely brutal. The attack trigger is nice, but it's not insane. It does mean it's more likely to get in for 4, and shutting off opposing flyers can have some value too, but I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Fear of Imposters, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 3/2 enchantment creature Nightmare at uncommon. It's got flash, and when it enters, you counter target spell. Its controller manifests Dread. This is a weird card. I don't love the idea of using this to counter my opponent's spell, but because you get a body out of it too, it does end up being kind of a wash, except that your opponent has more card selection and there's a good chance they'll be able to get something better than a 3/2 out of what they manifest eventually. Using this to counter your own thing is even worse, but it can be like an emergency loot effect, I guess, if you have like a useless card in your hand. None of those modes sound great to me, but it is an enchantment creature, and there are times where this countering something will be worthwhile. There will just also be times where it feels really underwhelming, giving it a C. Next up, it's Fear of Isolation, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/3 enchantment creature Nightmare at uncommon. As an additional cost to cast it, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. It has flying. This is kind of like a blue core Skyfisher, which is kind of cool. Notably, this isn't a May trigger or anything. You have to bounce something to cast it. That's a real cost early. Like, you don't really want to return a land to your hand on turn 2 just to get this out there, even if it is kind of efficient. And then in the late game, when it's easier to pay the alternate cost, it's not like a 2/3 flyer is insane. So what you really need to have going on is ways to turn this downside into upside, that is creatures with ETBs and lots of cards with Eerie. And even though we have those, it's still a pretty real setup cost. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Flood Pit's Drowner, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 merfolk at uncommon. It's got flash and vigilance, and when it enters, you tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. You can pay 1 generic and a blue and tap the Drowner, and you shuffle Flood Pit's Drowner and target creature with a stun counter on it into their owner's libraries. This looks pretty good. It basically has a bunch of modes. The spiciest one is to flash it in and stun something on the end of your opponent's turn, and then untap and pay 2 to shuffle that creature away along with the Drowner. That kind of makes it into a removal spell, and then you can also leverage the stun on this for all sorts of other stuff. So this has like a floor as a reasonable removal spell, and it can also just be like a big tempo play that helps you get in for a bunch of damage. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Get Out, which for 2 blue mana is an uncommon instant. Choose one, counter target creature or enchantment spell, or return 1 or 2 target creatures and or enchantments you own to your hand. This will be able to counter a huge number of spells in the format, and while the second mode isn't always useful, sometimes you can use it to save your enchantment creature from removal or rebuy some Eerie triggers. Costing 2 blue is a real problem, but once you've got that mana online, countering spells with this is likely to be great tempo since it's so cheap and can hit almost everything in the format. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Ghostly Keybearer, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 spirit at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you unlock a locked door of up to 1 target room you control. These days, a 4-mana 3/3 flyer is like a C-. That's how much creature efficiency has changed over the years, but this does have legit upside. Not having to pay mana to unlock a room is definitely relevant in blue, and sometimes it'll do something really insane. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Glimmer Burst, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common instant. Draw 2 cards, create a 1/1 white glimmer enchantment creature token. We've recently seen that draw spells that add to the board, even in a minor way, play pretty well, and that's what this is. Those enchantment tokens bring lots of extra value in the format too. Obviously, it can trigger Eerie. I think the first one of these is pretty solid, giving it a C. Next up, it's Leyline of Transformation, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield. As it enters, you choose a creature type. Creatures you control are the chosen type in addition to their other types. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. Yeah, no. This format doesn't have a big typal theme, and even in a format that did have one, using up a card in this effect would normally be pretty meaningless. It's an F in limited. Next up, it's Marina Vendrell's Grimoire, which for 5 generic and a blue is a rare legendary artifact. When it enters, if you cast it, you draw 5 cards. You have no maximum hand size and don't lose the game for having 0 or less life. Whenever you gain life, draw that many cards. Whenever you lose life, discard that many cards. Then if you have no cards in hand, you lose the game. This is pretty interesting. It basically makes your cards in hand your life. So the biggest problem here is that spending 6 mana to not impact the board can be incredibly dangerous, but this does make it so you can't lose the game for going down on life, sort of. Your opponent makes you discard with damage, so there's still a pretty good chance they can just attack, make you discard your whole hand, and then you lose the game. There will be situations where playing this is more downside than upside, like if you already have a bunch of life. Overall, this just won't work in limited. I think it's an F. Next up, it's Meat Locker and Drowned Diner, another enchantment room. The Meat Locker side is 2 generic and a blue, and when you unlock it, you tap up to 1 target creature and put 2 stun counters on it. The Drowned Diner side is 3 generic and 2 blue, and when you unlock it, you draw 3 and discard a card. This seems like a solid room. The Meat Locker side affects the board, and then later in the game, when you have the time, you can dig way deeper into your deck, which is pretty useful at that point. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's the Mind Skinner, which for 3 blue mana is a rare legendary enchantment creature, Nightmare. It is a 10/1. It can't be blocked, and if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent, prevent that damage, and each opponent mills that many cards. Yeah, this is another card that's not really here for limited. If you can use this to mill your opponent out, you would have just killed them with damage. The dream is to cast this on 3 and quickly mill out your opponent, but it's too hard to consistently cast it that early, and it dies to literally everything. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Mirror Room and Fractured Realm, another enchantment room. This one's at Mythic Rare. For 2 generic and a blue, the Mirror Room size says, when you unlock this door, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it's a reflection in addition to its other creature types. Fractured Realm is 5 generic and 2 blue. If a triggered ability of a permanent you control triggers, this ability triggers an additional time. 3 mana clones that can only copy your own stuff are generally okay, but not usually great. That's just because there's a decent chance you don't have something that's worth copying for that amount of mana, but there's also a chance you have something huge. So, it has kind of a bad floor, but a pretty good ceiling. The Fractured Realm side, on the other hand, is not very good in limited. You can't get it going until super late, and you're unlikely to line up triggered abilities all that well. Doors getting unlocked do often have triggered abilities, but that's still not enough for it to be anything special. I guess if you get it really late, you can cast Fractured Realm first, then unlock the Mirror Room and make 2 copies, but obviously that's pretty slow. If you have all the time in the world, that's how you're going to do things, but I think most of the time you'll want to run out Mirror Room when you can get enough value out of it to justify the cost, and you'll probably only unlock Fractured Realm when you have nothing better to do, and it's unlikely it ever does anything else. I think this is probably just a C in limited. Next up, it's Overlord of the Flood Pits, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 5/3 enchantment creature avatar horror at Mythic Rare. It's got impending 4 for 1 generic and 2 blue. This is an alternate cost, and if you cast it that way, it enters with 4 time counters on it and isn't a creature until the last is removed. At the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it. It's got flying, and when it enters or attacks, you draw 2 cards and then discard a card. 3 mana to draw 2 and discard 1 isn't going to feel great, but this eventually gives you a beefy flyer that gets that trigger over and over again. Also, paying 5 for a 5/3 flyer with this ETB and attack trigger is really good. Even if you can only cast it normally, this would probably be a bomb, so the impending upside definitely gets it there. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Paranormal Analyst, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human detective at uncommon. Whenever you manifest Dread, put a card you put into your graveyard this way into your hand. This is an absurd payoff for manifesting Dread. I mean, it turns all of your manifest triggers into 2/2s that draw you a card, and for the most part, manifest Dread is priced to move, so you're going to get a good deal when you do it. That said, this definitely needs a build-around grade since it has a really mediocre baseline. It's kind of a secret blue-green card since that's a color pair that is most likely to have a lot of manifest Dread, but I think if you've got 4 or so cards at manifest, you can play this. It's probably a D in most blue decks, but it has a ceiling as high as a B. Next up, it's Piranha Fly, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 fish insect at common. It's got flying and it enters tapped. A 2 mana 2/1 flyer is like a C, but entering tapped is brutal. It effectively means it doesn't add to the board until the following turn, and there are just so many situations where you need to be able to block or trade where this just can't do the job. And it's not like the ceiling is anything special. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Scrabbling Skull Crab, which for 1 blue mana is a crab skeleton at uncommon. It's a 0/3. It has Eerie. Target player mills 2 cards. Most of the time, mill build-arounds don't work in Limited. It's just hard to have a critical mass of ways to mill your opponent to make them actually worthwhile. They do tend to be better when you mill yourself, but I'm still pretty underwhelmed by this overall. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Silent Hall Creeper, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/1 enchantment creature horror. At rare, it can't be blocked, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you choose one that hasn't been chosen. Put 2 +1/+1 counters in Silent Hall Creeper, draw a card, or Silent Hall Creeper becomes a copy of another target creature you control. This is really good. It is a bit vulnerable at first, but it's unblockable, and if left unchecked, delivers several cards worth of value before eventually becoming a larger creature. Keep in mind when it does become a copy of something, it can be blocked. But yeah, this seems good all game long, and especially game-breaking if you play it on 2. Things will get out of hand in a hurry, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Stalked Researcher, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common human wizard with Defender. It's a 3/3, and it has Eerie. It can attack this turn as though it didn't have Defender. Pretty much every set has a blue 2-mana 3/3 with Defender that can attack when X happens, and they only very rarely pan out. Some of them do, but they're the exception to prove the rule. Even in an enchantment-heavy set like this one, the Researcher will be unable to attack far too often, and just relying on it as a defensive creature is a bad idea in this era of high-octane combat tricks. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Stay Hidden, Stay Silent, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment aura with Enchant Creature. When it enters, tap Enchanted Creature. Enchanted Creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and you can pay 4 generic and 2 blue, and shuffle the Enchanted Creature into its owner's library, and then manifest Dread. Activate only as a sorcery. This doesn't stop activated or static abilities, and that's always annoying. At least initially it doesn't. Eventually, you can send the creature away and get a 2/2 and some card selection for your trouble, and that's some legit late game upside on a card that's already passable removal, giving it a C+. Next up, it's the Tale of Tamayo, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare legendary enchantment Saga. The first 3 chapters mill 2 cards, and if 2 cards that share a card type are milled this way, draw a card and repeat this process. And chapter 4 says exile any number of target instant sorcery and or Tamayo planeswalker cards from your graveyard, copy them, you may cast any number of the copies. This has a really high ceiling where you draw lots of cards and mill yourself a bunch, and then cast several spells with chapter 4. Even in a set with a graveyard theme, I'm pretty skeptical of this. Drawing cards with the first 3 chapters is tough, and milling alone probably isn't enough since you're taking a big risk of not adding to the board on turn 3. I think it's a D. Next, it's Tunnel Surveyor, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human detective at common. When it enters, you create a 1/1 white glimmer enchantment creature token. A 3-mana 2/2 that makes a 1/1 token is always an above average card in Limited, and this brings some enchantment upside to the mix. You know, it's a non-enchantment card that will trigger Eerie, which is nice, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Twist Reality, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common instant. Choose one, counter target spell, or manifest Dread. Cancel is usually like a D+, and this has a second mode, which does make a difference. It means that if you went to the trouble of leaving your mana up and your opponent doesn't cast anything, you can at least get yourself Manifest Dread going, which is pretty nice. You're definitely overpaying whichever option you choose, and the double blue can be a problem, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Unable to Scream, which for 1 blue mana is a common enchantment aura with Enchant Creature. Enchanted Creature loses all abilities and is a toy artifact creature with base, power, and toughness 0/2 in addition to its other types. As long as Enchanted Creature is face down, it can't be turned face up. Even at 1 mana, this kind of removal is super underwhelming. This is because you actually end up behind your opponent when it comes to cards, since you spent a whole card removing their creature and they can still chump with it at a minimum, and there's plenty of other stuff they can do with it too. Keeping a manifested thing from flipping is cute, but yeah, this isn't good, giving it a D. Next up, it's Underwater Tunnel and Slimy Aquarium, an enchantment room at common. The Underwater Tunnel side costs 1 blue, and when you unlock the door, you surveil 2. The Slimy Aquarium side is 3 generic and a blue, and when you unlock it, you manifest Dread, then put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. As with many of these, neither side of this exactly feels like you're getting a good deal. 1 blue mana to surveil 2 wouldn't be a good card you'd ever play on its own, and paying 4 for a 3/3 manifest Dread is pretty clunky too. But you put them both together, and I think you have a solid card. One that can trigger Eerie pretty nicely, along with some very real graveyard synergy. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Unnerving Grasp, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. Return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, Manifest Dread. Basically, this is Manifest Dread-a-War, and I'm here for it. Adding a 2/2 with upside to the board while adding 2 cards to the graveyard and bouncing something is pretty sweet for 3 mana in this format. This is going to be a great tempo play and generate more than a card worth of value in most cases. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Unwilling Vessel, which for 2 generic and a blue is a human wizard at uncommon. It's a 3/2 with vigilance, and it has Eerie, put a possession counter on Unwilling Vessel, and when the vessel dies, you create an XX blue spirit creature token with flying, where X is the number of counters on Unwilling Vessel. A 3-mana 3/2 with vigilance is not a good starting point, but even if you can only get 1 counter on this thing, you suddenly feel pretty good about your investment since you can trade it off and get a 1/1 flyer. And if it sticks around longer, what you can get in return might be a huge threat. There are plenty of enchantments in the set, of course, so doing that isn't impossible, but I am worried about this card's starting point. Dying to common 1-mana removal is kind of a problem. Still, the upside is big enough that I'm willing to give this a B-. And our last card is Vanish from Sight, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common instant. Target non-land permanent's owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library, surveil 1. Virtually every time we see this style of card, and they've been putting one in like every set for like 3 years now, it ends up being one of Blue's best commons. 4 mana is a lot, but it's not colored mana intensive, and it can hit lots of permanents at instant speed, giving you 2-for-1 potential, while still trading 1-for-1 the rest of the time, and surveils a nice bit of value to tack on, giving this a C+. So, those are all the blue cards in Duskmourn. In the next video, we'll look at all the black ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.